Thank you for joining us for our 10th episode of HeLPiNG Questions. I'm Dr. Alicia Luque, HeLPiNG Questions host. In today's episode, we will have the opportunity to ask Professor Dave Miller our 10th HeLPiNG question. Professor Dave Miller is an assistant professor in the Department of Spanish and Italian Studies at the University of Illinois at Chicago in the United States. Dave's research is groundbreaking and absolutely fascinating, and focuses on better understanding how the bi- and multilingual mind works, and in exploring how the many ways in which knowing and using additional languages impacts the human experience. Please take a seat and stay with us as we get to hear more from Dave about how the languages we speak as bilinguals impact the decisions we make and how we behave. Welcome, Dave, to the 10th episode of HeLPiNG Questions. We're so excited to have you as our guest and to be able to discover together fascinating scientific facts about bilingualism. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Absolutely. I appreciate the invitation. I'm excited as well.
Thank you. We're so excited to have you, and considering the important contributions you have made to help us better understand the bilingual mind and how the languages we speak shape us, cognition and emotions. We're really looking forward to asking you our 10th helping question. Should we jump right in?
Absolutely.
Okay, great. Then, Dave, based on your experience, knowledge, and expertise, would you say that are there any ways in which the languages we speak as bilinguals affect decision making, evaluative judgments, or our behavior?
That's a really great question. And I'll give you a short answer and then obviously a longer answer. And the short answer is yes, there are many ways in which the language that we speak, or the languages in this case that we speak, affect the way that we think. And then, of course, the way that we think affects the way that we behave. And so the short answer is yes. And the slightly longer answer is quite complicated, but a lot of fun. So I think it's first probably important to start talking about how language in general is used and how it might affect decision making more generally, as opposed to strictly being bilingual. And obviously, language is used in the context, or mainly used in the context of social intentions, right? And we use it very often as a means of achieving our goals or the desires that we have in the social world. So we can use language to do a number of things. We use language to talk to other people, to convince other people, to convey our beliefs to other people, right? And to convince them that our opinions have merit and so forth. And so really when people are evaluating language, that language has a strong probability of influencing the behavior of any given individual at any given time. And so it stands to reason then that, bilinguals are humans as well. They just have multiple languages, or they speak multiple languages. And so it's very reasonable to suspect also that their two languages would affect the way that they think and perhaps the way that they behave. Um, and I think where I'll start is sort of at the beginning, or what I understand is the beginning of what has come to be known as the foreign language effect. That is, when individuals are using a foreign language, their decisions, their behavior, their social intentions, and so forth might be different in their non-native language context and in the first language context. So in 2012, I believe, a fantastic team of researchers here in Chicago at the University of Chicago, led by Boaz Kaiser, did a really interesting study using bilinguals as their test population. So the purpose of this was to see if bilingualism, given that we know that bilinguals process language differently, we know that they have different psychosocial connections to their language, their non-native language, as compared to their first. And so maybe some of these differences will show in the way that people make decisions in each of their languages. And they very cleverly used a design that was put forward by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky in the late 70s. And this was what was called the framing effect. So people, when they are reading situations or certain contexts, people tend to be risk averse when the context is forcing you to think about gains, whether it's gambling or money or lives being saved or lost. So they're risk averse when gains are on the line, and then they're risk seeking when loss is on the line, right? You have nothing to lose, so let's put all of our eggs in one basket and go for it and hope this works out. And this has been going on, like I said, since the late 70s, and this research is rather robust. And Boaz and his team decided, well, let's put bilinguals to the test and see if they behave the same way that people have been behaving since the late 70s, but let's change the context of language. And what they found was that these bilinguals in the first language behaved very similarly to people who were monolinguals using their native language. But the bilinguals seem to behave quite a bit differently. That is, this difference or this bias, you can say, between gain framing and loss framing disappeared when bilinguals were presented with this information in their non-native language. And this extended beyond, this framing effect of what Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky had found, and they found, Boaz and his team also found this effect when they were looking at bilinguals making economic decisions or betting decisions. Other researchers found that it also seemed to influence the way that people thought about crime, the way that they thought about honesty, and so forth. And so this seems to be something that is more generalizable, not just in terms of this framing effect, but it's certainly something that affects the way that bilinguals think and therefore behave more generally. And from that study, then, one of the first ways in which I think that this kind of foreign language effect research hit the road running and became very popular was when Albert Costa and his colleagues did a foreign language effect study looking at the way that bilinguals made moral decisions, right? Because, like I said at the very beginning, we use language in the context of social intentions. And much of what we do with language, we're trying to either move ourselves or to move other people or to change things, right? And so it's very fun and interesting to look at the way that people make moral decisions in each of their languages. And they presented these bilinguals with the trolley problem, the infamous trolley problem. And in this particular hypothetical moral quandary, what you have is a train that is coming down the tracks, and there is some number of people, usually 5 people, who are lying down on the tracks, and the train's going to run over them unless somebody does something about it. And there are 2 contexts that are meant to dissociate the types of reasoning processes that people usually engage in when they're making this type of decision. One of them, the first context that I'm going to explain, is meant to be more of a logical kind of a reasoning test, right? And the other one more emotional, to help us get to the center of what's driving, what are the mechanisms that are driving the differences here. So the train is coming down the tracks, and there are some people laying on the tracks. And in the first case, which is called the switch case, the person who can affect the outcome of this particular scenario can pull a switch, the train will divert, and instead of running over 5 people, it will run over just 1. And people are asked, what would you do? Would you save the 5 and end up killing the 1, or would you do nothing? Most people in that particular context say that they would pull the switch. And this is what is said to be a utilitarian judgment, right? People are making this decision because they understand that 5 lives saved is more useful or has better utility, more utility than 1 life lost. So most people say, okay, I'm going to pull the switch. But then when you change the context, and it's the exact same, so the train's coming down the tracks, it's going to run over some people, and somebody can do something about it. Instead of pulling a switch, which is arguably fairly impersonal, you now have somebody that's standing atop a footbridge, and this person is potentially pushing another person off of the footbridge to divert the train. And you ask these people, what are you going to do? Are you going to push the person off the footbridge, or are you going to do nothing? Most people in this particular situation, that is most monolinguals using their native language, would say, no, I'm not going to push the person off the footbridge now. So you see a sharp decrease in the acceptability of that particular context, unless you give that context to bilinguals who are using their non-native language. And then what Albert Costa and his colleagues saw was that there was a higher probability that bilinguals would accept the footbridge case. Of course, they looked at things like proficiency. So there was an effect of proficiency. That is, the bilinguals who were more proficient, perhaps more connected to their language and maybe able to feel more in that language, behaved more like individuals in their first language. That is, they're not as likely to push the person off the footbridge. And then lower proficiency learners, that as you went down, they went from advanced to intermediate to sort of beginner learners. The beginner learners were the ones who were most likely to say, yes, we're going to push this person off the footbridge. And there are sort of two ways of thinking about that they propose in the article. And it really comes down to what in the psychological research has been called dual systems theory or dual systems approach. And in that particular context or in that particular approach, the brain is said to process information with the help of two systems. So you have system one, which takes care of your fast, automatic, intuitive, or intuition-based approach types of reasoning, right? So emotion is very relevant to system one. And then you have system two, which is your slower, more supervisory and deliberate reasoning system. And the question that they asked in that particular study was, which system is really responsible for what's going on here, given that bilinguals perhaps have a greater psychosocial distance or connection to their non-native language. Maybe that's what's driving it, but maybe also because processing a foreign language comes with a certain cognitive cost, right? It's more difficult to process in that language. We want to know which of these two systems is responsible for the decision outcomes that we've seen in our study. And it turns out that from 2014, from that particular study onward, up until 2017, when some other researchers looked at really what the mechanisms responsible were, it seems to be the case that it's emotion, or it's very emotion dependent. So when they do these same kinds of studies and there is no emotional component to them, you don't really see the foreign language effect. But when you do these studies and there is a component of the study that has a strong emotional impact, that's usually when you see the foreign language effect. In other words, a methodology that's designed to induce emotions is more likely to elicit this effect than a study that is just looking at general reasoning and there's no emotional component. And again, of course, since 2014, now this has been looked at in a variety of ways, right? And now you're getting linguists, psycholinguists, neurolinguists, all sorts of linguists, and even psychologists who are looking at this and testing the scope of the effect. How can we poke and prod this and see where it ends, where it begins, how it starts, how it finishes, and so forth? And it turns out that proficiency, of course, affects this. The type of bilingual affects this. So whether somebody learns their two languages from birth going forward, or whether they learn their second language as an adult and so forth, obviously all of these things are going to have an effect, and it turns out that they do. So I should note also that not every study that sets out to find the foreign language effect finds it. And it seems to be the case that there are some subtle methodological choices that are being made that might affect that, right? And some of them I've already mentioned. But generally speaking, when we're looking at heightened cases of emotion, that's when you tend to find it. And so now that's sort of where the state of the field is that there's more agreement as to what the mechanisms are, right? Because now we have fMRI studies looking at this, showing that the regions of the brain involved in emotional reasoning and so forth are implicated to a greater extent in the first language than they are in the second language. So it seems to be some sort of emotional suppression when making these decisions in a non-native language. We have EEG and ERP analyses that are looking at this as well that show very similar results. But it's still relatively unclear as to whether or not this is entirely emotion or it's also these other sorts of, perhaps cognitive load issues that come along with just being bilingual. And I think that's where the field stands now is really trying to tease apart those two mechanisms. Although from what I gather, it looks like emotion really is sort of atop the list of the things that are driving this effect in bilinguals.
Thank you, Dave. This is fascinating. And since we have you here, we were wondering if we can ask you another question, right? So basically for everyone to kind of like recap some of the important things that you said, right? So basically it seems like, right, like learning a language is not only important when learning a language to learn the rules and how language functions, right? But maybe try to also create emotional connection to the language. So maybe in the way in which you behave with the language when you have to operate becomes a little bit less of a detached approach to the language as well as what we've seen, right? But on On the other side of the coin, we have also research that shows that bilinguals, when they make decisions in their, let's say, second language or non-native language or less dominant language, they seem to be a little bit more objective in a way, right? So of course, this again is a new field of research. It makes us think in so many different ways about how the mind operates, how the human experience also kind of unfolds, right, depending on the different experiences that you have. But I was wondering, of course, we're not trying to say don't let bilinguals make decisions, right? They're gonna kill everybody. This is not what we're trying
Right,
to say.
right.
But then I'm thinking, since you're an expert on all of this, many of the things that we touch on, like based on the emergent research that we have, what could be like some new insights that we can have in order to try to understand, what is the bilingual experience based on the fact that we have some evidence suggesting that the language experiences that we have also shape the way in which we behave. So do you think is some of this research actually helping us think about the bilingual mind differently? Are these any important consequences that we should have, or insights that we should have when thinking about our emotions in the different languages that we speak? It was a long segue question, but
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I mean, that's a fantastic question. And I think it's a really needed question that we should be asking ourselves. And I think, of course, the short answer again is going to be yes, right? There are a host of background factors we know that affect language acquisition. We also know that those background factors affect functional and structural components of the brain. And so, of course, that's probably going to have an effect on the way that these individuals are making decisions as well. I think, a lot of people like to ask, what are the broader implications of this kind of research? And you're completely correct in saying, nobody's saying that bilinguals are immoral, right? That they lack morality. This is simply, your connection to a second language might not just be, and that is your emotional connection to a second language, might not just be as strong as it is to your first language, and that's what's leading you to make decisions differently in that language compared to your first one. So I think one of the ways in which we can start looking at this, and it's already been done and continuing to be done, but one of the really interesting ways that we can start looking at these questions going forward is sort of stepping away from the very common ways of looking at the foreign language effect, because everybody wants to use the trolley problem or problems that are very similar to the trolley problem, right? Where you're pitting utilitarian judgments against deontological judgments, looking at whether or not they affect system one and system two. And of course, Joshua Green has been doing research for quite a long time now, over 2 decades, on moral decision making using the trolley problem and similar tasks. And I think it's quite clear that these tasks do show or dissociate reasoning strategies across context. That's perfectly clear. But what would be nice to understand is if we can start looking at bilingualism in the context of the foreign language effect outside of these hypothetical moral quandaries, right? Where you're just looking, how relevant is it to ask a bilingual to evaluate the trolley problem compared to, say, other problems that might actually exist in the daily life of these bilinguals? And so this, at the beginning, I did mention some research that has looked at the way that bilinguals evaluate things like crime and honesty and lying, economic judgments and so forth. And so I think that's really some really interesting ways in which we can start looking at this, especially because research in the psycho and neurolinguistic field really does show that in order to be moved to do something, right, what is relevant really to that is how the result relates to our personal interests. So the closer or the more we can tap into somebody's personal identity, and the more that we can tap into their personal interests, the more we're going to be able to instigate emotion. And so if we really want to test the boundaries of the foreign language effect outside of these sort of hypothetical moral quandaries, we want to test the real world boundaries. We start asking people, how does bilingualism affect pro-social behavior? Which is, a project that I did not so long ago with some students here at the University of Illinois, Chicago, or how it might affect voting behaviors. Right? Can you get individuals on either side of the US political spectrum to behave differently than they would in their first language, in their second language? And it seems to be that the answer, at least preliminarily, is yes, we can. And so I think, so, when we're talking about more generalizable results or things that where we can take this research future directions, that's really, to me at least, is what's very interesting to see in the field is, testing the scope and the boundaries of the foreign language effect and applying these methodologies outside of, lab settings and really getting bilinguals to engage with language and reasoning contexts that are arguably more relevant to their day-to-day lives.
Thank you, Dave. This was super insightful and exciting, and a little bit of a different episode than what we've done so far, right? Because now we're moving into really interesting questions that we're trying to also answer in the field of research, right? That have important connections about trying to understand, what the bilingual mind and experience is beyond what we've even asked ourselves before, right? And you've been one of these researchers and amazing scientists, right, leading us into trying to understand, how the languages that we speak and whether you're more attached or detached to your different languages might actually affect the way you behave differently, right? Again, disclaimer, this is not to say in any way, we're both multilingual speakers, so this is not to say that we in any way think that bilingualism leads to wrong decisions in any way. This is kind of us being now more geeky into trying to understand, right, what it means, to be bilingual, multilingual, more generally. Do you agree?
Absolutely. I mean, and this is something that you see in essentially any bilingual research that comes out now is the people highlighting how many bilinguals there are in the world actually, right? It's now the norm that the majority of the world is bi or multilingual. And so this kind of research is very interesting because you have, of course, bi and multilingual people making up the majority of the world who are out in the world making real decisions on a day-to-day basis. And so to examine the ways in which they're going to be making those decisions is very useful. So I think it's a fantastic, although it's new, it's a fantastic way in which we can increase our understanding of the bilingual mind, but also not just the mind and looking at bilingual behavior.
Thank you, Dave. This is amazing. Thank you for all your insightful answers and for helping us better understand all of these really interesting questions. And of course, thanks to your work and to help us also better understand what the bilingual experience is like and how the languages we speak shape the way in which we relate to the world and feel the world. And it was an absolute pleasure to have you. And we cannot wait to hear more about the amazing things you're going to discover. Thank you.
Absolutely. Well, thanks again for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
We really hope you enjoyed our 10th helping question, in that Dave's fascinating scientific insight and professional experience helped you to learn some new things about how the languages we speak as bilinguals shape our decisions and our behavior. Stay tuned for our next episode coming to you in late May. We will get to ask Dr. Ethan Kutlu, postdoctoral researcher and incoming assistant professor in the departments of linguistics and psychological and brain sciences at the University of Iowa in Iowa City in the United States, our 11th helping question. How are bilingual identities shaped by the different cultural, historical, and sociopolitical biases we're constantly surrounded by in the world we live in? We look forward to seeing you all back here in late May. Also, do not forget to subscribe and to share with us your thoughts, feedback, and comments on any of our social media channels. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to seeing you back here for our next Helping Questions episode. Bye!